There's a specific kind of kid almost nobody notices growing up. Not the loudest one in the room, not the one who gets in trouble. The quiet one, standing near the doorway at a family gathering, watching everyone's face a little too closely, already knowing something's wrong before anyone said a word. Teachers call this kid sensitive. Parents call this kid too emotional. And for years, that kid believes them. What none of them realize is that they're watching the early construction of one of the rarest kinds of power a human being can develop. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why the most sensitive person in the room often ends up being the most powerful one in the room 20 years later. Here's the mistake almost everyone makes about sensitive people early in life. They assume feeling deeply is the same thing as being fragile. They look at a kid who cries easily, who notices tension nobody else notices, who takes things personally that other kids shrug off, and they file that kid under weak, soft, someone who's going to have a hard time out there. And for a long stretch of that person's life, this assumption looks accurate. They do get hurt more easily. They do absorb things other people brush off. But here's what almost nobody, watching from the outside, understands. What looks like fragility in year one is often just raw material, untrained, unshaped. And raw material, given enough pressure and enough time, doesn't stay raw forever. Think about how most empathic people actually get built, because it's rarely a peaceful origin story. Most of them didn't grow up in calm, predictable homes where emotions were named clearly and handled gently. A lot of them grew up scanning a room the second they walked into it, reading a parent's face before that parent said a single word, because the difference between a good night and a bad night depended entirely on catching the warning signs early. They learned to notice a change in tone of voice half a second before anyone else in the house did. They learned to sense when someone was saying one thing and feeling something completely different underneath it. Nobody sat them down and taught them this. Life taught them this, the way life teaches any skill it demands for survival. And here's the part that changes everything about how we should think about this. A skill built out of necessity doesn't disappear once the necessity is gone. It stays. It becomes part of how that person moves through every room for the rest of their life, whether they want it to or not. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Nora, because her story lays this out more clearly than any theory could on its own. Nora grew up in a house where her mother's mood decided the emotional weather for everyone inside it. Some mornings, warm and easy. Other mornings, cold and sharp for no reason Nora could ever predict in advance. So Nora learned to read the signs. The exact way a door closed. The specific pitch of a sigh from the kitchen. The pause before her mother answered a simple question. By age 9, Nora could walk into a room and know, within seconds, whether it was safe to ask for something or safe to stay quiet. Nobody called this a skill. Nobody praised her for it. It just felt like survival. And survival doesn't usually feel impressive while you're living inside it. By the time Nora was an adult, this same scanning ability had migrated into every relationship she had. She noticed when a friend's compliment didn't quite match their tone. She noticed when a co-worker's confidence in a meeting was covering for real uncertainty underneath. She noticed the half-second delay before someone answered a question they didn't want to answer honestly. For years, this felt exhausting more than useful. She absorbed too much. She took on other people's moods like they were her own. She apologized for things that weren't her fault, just to keep the emotional temperature of a room stable, the same way she used to manage her mother's moods as a child. This is the stage almost every empathic person gets stuck in for a while, sometimes for a very long while. Call it the absorbing stage. You feel everything, but you haven't yet learned how to use what you feel. You're a highly sensitive instrument with no training on how to read your own readings. At this stage, sensitivity really does look and feel like a burden, because it is one. Untrained perception isn't power yet. It's just noise with volume turned all the way up. But here's where the story usually takes a turn that most people never expect, And it doesn't happen because someone finally gave Nora a manual for how to use her sensitivity wisely. It happens because life kept forcing the same lesson at her, over and over, until she had no choice but to learn it. Nora's late 20s were rough. A friendship that quietly drained her for years before she finally saw the pattern. A relationship where she kept excusing behavior that any outside observer could have spotted as a problem in the first month. A boss who used her conscientiousness against her, piling on responsibility because he knew she'd never say no. Each of these situations hurt. Each one cost her something real, but each one also left behind a very specific kind of residue, and that residue is the part almost nobody talks about honestly. It's called pattern recognition, and once it starts accumulating, it doesn't go away. After the friendship ended, Nora noticed something. The next time someone in her life started acting a little too familiar, a little too fast, showering her with compliments before they'd earned the right to, some part of her brain flagged it immediately, the way a smoke detector flags smoke before you can even see fire. After the relationship ended, she noticed something else. The next time a man told her a slightly too tragic backstory in the first few weeks of dating, designed to make her feel like the only person who truly understood him, she felt a small, cool distance form inside her instead of the rush of sympathy that used to override her judgment completely. After the job situation resolved, she noticed the sharpest shift of all. The next time someone tried to guilt her into taking on more than she wanted to carry, the guilt still showed up, but it didn't automatically win anymore. This is the actual mechanism behind why sensitive people so often become formidable later in life, and it has nothing to do with luck or some mystical gift. It's simple, repeatable psychology. Every time someone highly attuned to emotion gets hurt by a pattern and survives it and reflects on it honestly instead of just moving past it numbly, their internal database updates. The next version of that same pattern gets caught faster. The version after that gets caught even faster than that. Over years, this compounds into something that looks, from the outside, almost like a superpower. The ability to sense manipulation before it fully unfolds. The ability to tell the difference between someone being genuinely vulnerable and someone performing vulnerability to get something. The ability to read a room and know with unnerving accuracy exactly what's actually happening underneath the words being said out loud. This is worth pausing on because it's the single most important reframe in this entire video. What most people call intuition in a highly sensitive person isn't magic. It's compressed experience. It's every past hurt, every miscalculation, every time they trusted the wrong person, distilled down into a fast, automatic read that fires before conscious thought even catches up. The child who once had to read danger in a house learns, decades later, to read motive in a boardroom, a first date, a negotiation, a friendship that's starting to feel one-sided. Same exact skill, just aimed at a much wider world. Now, here's where things get interesting because sensing patterns accurately is only half the equation. The other half, the part that actually turns perception into power, is something almost nobody develops without going through real pain first. And that's the ability to act on what you see instead of just quietly enduring it. For most of her 20s, Nora saw the patterns clearly and still couldn't stop herself from participating in them. She'd notice a friend only calling when they needed something, and she'd still pick up the phone every single time, because saying no felt like abandoning someone, and abandoning someone felt unforgivable to a person raised to believe her worth depended on being endlessly available. She'd notice a partner's promises never quite matching his follow-through, and she'd still make excuses for him out loud to her own friends, because holding him accountable felt like an attack rather than a boundary. Seeing a pattern clearly and having the internal permission to act differently because of it are two completely separate stages of growth, and most people spend years stuck in the gap between them. The shift that finally closes that gap almost never comes from a single dramatic moment. It usually comes from accumulation. One boundary attempted badly, followed by guilt. Another boundary attempted, slightly better, followed by less guilt. 100 small repetitions later, something that used to feel impossible starts to feel almost automatic. For Nora, this showed up first in something small. A friend canceled on her for the fourth time in a row, offering the same vague excuse she always offered, and instead of saying it was fine, the way Nora had said it was fine 100 times before, she said plainly, "I've noticed this happens a lot, and it's starting to bother me." No apology attached to the sentence, no softening it into a joke to make it easier to hear. Just the truth, stated once, and left there. This is such a small moment in the grand scheme of a life, and yet it's exactly the kind of moment that marks the actual turning point most people never notice happening in real time. Because once someone highly attuned to other people's feelings finally learns to hold space for her own feelings with equal seriousness, everything about how she moves through the world changes. She's not less compassionate. She still notices everything she always noticed. She still feels other people's pain as clearly as ever. What's different is that noticing and feeling no longer automatically override her own judgment the way they used to. Compassion stops being something that erases her and starts being something she offers on purpose, from a place of choice instead of compulsion. This is worth naming directly because it's the exact distinction that separates a sensitive person who stays stuck in an exhausting, depleting version of empathy for their entire life from one who eventually turns that same sensitivity into something closer to quiet authority. It isn't about feeling less. It's about no longer confusing feeling with obligation. Once that confusion clears, an enormous amount of energy that used to get spent managing everyone else's emotional state becomes available for something else entirely, actually building a life instead of constantly reacting to other people's. Something else happens around this same stage that deserves real attention, because it explains why so many people who used to exploit a highly sensitive person eventually lose interest in her completely. Manipulation, at its core, depends on predictability. It depends on someone knowing exactly which buttons produce exactly which reactions, reliably, every single time. A person who over-explains herself when accused of something. A person who apologizes automatically to diffuse tension, regardless of whether she actually did anything wrong. A person who can be guilted into saying yes by simply implying she'd be selfish for saying no. These are the exact levers a manipulative person, consciously or not, learns to pull. Once someone stops responding to those levers the way she used to, the entire dynamic breaks, and it doesn't break loudly. It breaks quietly, which is exactly why it's so unsettling to the person on the other end of it. They pull the old lever, the guilt trip, the tragic story, the accusation designed to make her doubt her own read of the situation, and for the first time, nothing happens. No scramble, no over-explaining, no automatic yes. Just a calm, level response, or sometimes just silence. People who were used to having easy access to her emotional reactions often describe this shift the same way. You've changed. And they're right. But what they're actually reacting to isn't coldness. It's the disappearance of a lever they used to be able to pull whenever they wanted something. This is worth sitting with, because it explains something that confuses a lot of people watching this transformation happen in someone they know. Growth in a formerly overly accommodating person almost always looks like a personality change from the outside, even when it's actually the opposite. It's not a new personality. It's the same depth of feeling that was always there, finally paired with the boundaries that should have existed alongside it from the beginning. The compassion doesn't disappear. It just stops being available on demand to anyone who asks for it, regardless of whether they've earned it. Let's talk about what this actually looks like once it fully sets in, because the end result surprises a lot of people who only know the earlier, more overwhelmed version of a sensitive person. By her late 30s, Nora is a different presence in almost every room she enters, though she'd tell you she still feels like the same person underneath it all. She still notices everything she used to notice. The tension in a colleague's voice during a meeting, the gap between what a new acquaintance says and what their body language suggests, the subtle test someone runs early in a friendship to see how much they can get away with before she pushes back. None of that awareness has dulled with age. If anything, it's sharper than it's ever been. What's changed is what she does with it. She doesn't announce what she notices anymore, the way she might have in her 20s, desperate to be believed, desperate to prove her perception was accurate. She simply adjusts, quietly, based on what she's seeing, without needing anyone else's agreement to trust her own read of a situation. When someone tests a boundary early on, she doesn't argue about it or demand they acknowledge what they just did. She just recalibrates how much access that person gets going forward, and lets her actions communicate what she used to try to explain in words. This is an enormous shift, because it moves her out of a position where her peace depends on being understood, and into a position where her peace depends on nothing but her own clarity. People are drawn to this quality without always being able to name why. It isn't charisma in the traditional sense. It isn't dominance or volume or charm. It's something closer to gravity. A steadiness that comes from someone who's no longer confused by appearances, who's stopped being surprised by the same manipulative patterns showing up in new disguises, because she's already seen every disguise those patterns tend to wear. People trust this kind of steadiness instinctively, even when they can't fully explain what they're responding to. Because most of us can feel, on some level, the difference between someone performing confidence and someone who's actually settled inside themselves. There's an important distinction worth making here because it's the exact point where a lot of people get this transformation wrong, sometimes turning genuine growth into something that looks similar on the surface but functions completely differently underneath. There's a version of this shift that leads somewhere healthy, and a version that leads somewhere brittle, and the difference between them comes down to one word: suspicion versus discernment. Suspicion assumes the worst about people by default. It sees a threat in every new relationship, treats every compliment as a setup, keeps everyone at arm's length regardless of what they've actually done. This might look like strength from a distance, but it isn't. It's fear wearing armor, and it costs a person enormously because it closes her off from the genuine connection her sensitivity was always capable of building in the first place. Discernment is different. Discernment doesn't assume the worst. It simply pays attention, gathers real evidence over time, and responds to what's actually there instead of what might theoretically be there. A suspicious person distrusts everyone equally. A discerning person trusts accurately, extending real warmth to people who've earned it while staying clear-eyed about people who haven't. This distinction matters because the goal was never to become someone who trusts less. It was always to become someone who trusts more accurately. Nora, years into this shift, isn't guarded with everyone in her life. If anything, the relationships she keeps have become deeper than they ever were in her 20s, because she's no longer spreading the same exhausting, unfiltered availability across everyone who asks for it. She's directing real depth toward people who've actually demonstrated they deserve it. And that concentration makes those specific relationships far richer than the diluted, indiscriminate openness she used to offer to anyone who showed up asking for her time. Let me give you a second story, because one example only tells part of this. And this version shows how the exact same mechanism plays out in a completely different setting. Consider a man named Elliot, who spent most of his 20s as what people affectionately called a pushover at work. Not because he lacked talent, because every time a colleague needed a favor, every time a manager needed someone to absorb extra work without complaint, Elliot was the reliable yes. He told himself this made him valuable. For years, it mostly just made him tired and mostly invisible to the exact kind of recognition he actually wanted. The turning point for Elliot wasn't one dramatic confrontation. It was a slow accumulation of small data points, the same way it was for Nora. He noticed that the colleague who always needed help never once offered to return the favor when Elliot needed something. He noticed that the manager who praised his flexibility in private never once mentioned it during a performance review where it might have actually mattered for his career. He noticed that saying yes to everything hadn't earned him more respect. It had simply taught everyone around him that his time carried no real cost, which meant it carried no real value either. What changed for Elliot wasn't his ability to notice these patterns. He'd been noticing them for years, the same way Nora had been noticing hers. What changed was his willingness to act differently because of what he noticed. The next time a colleague asked for a last-minute favor, he said simply, "I can't take that on right now." No lengthy justification. No apologetic tone designed to soften the blow. Just a clear, calm answer. The colleague seemed surprised, maybe even a little put off, and Elliot noticed something he hadn't expected. The world didn't end. Nobody stopped speaking to him. The mild discomfort of disappointing someone, a discomfort he'd spent his entire life avoiding at nearly any cost, turned out to be completely survivable. This is the part of the story that matters most, because it's the part almost nobody explains clearly when they talk about boundaries. The fear of disappointing people, of seeming difficult, of being labeled selfish, is almost always far larger in a person's imagination than it turns out to be in reality. Once someone tests that fear against actual evidence, repeatedly, and survives it, the fear itself starts to shrink. Not because the person stopped caring what others think, because she finally gathered enough real data to know that her worst-case predictions rarely matched what actually happened. Both of these stories point toward the same underlying mechanism, one worth naming as plainly as possible, because it's the actual engine behind everything we've been describing. Sensitivity provides the raw data. Experience turns that raw data into pattern recognition. And boundaries, practiced repeatedly despite discomfort, turn pattern recognition into actual power, the kind that changes how a person moves through every room she walks into for the rest of her life. Skip any one of these three ingredients and the transformation stalls. Sensitivity without experience stays naive. Experience without boundaries stays exhausting. And boundaries without the underlying sensitivity just become rigidity, a wall instead of a filter. Here's the part that ties everything back together, because it's easy to hear stories like these and think the lesson is simply become less sensitive, toughen up, stop feeling things so much. That would be exactly the wrong lesson to take from any of this. The entire transformation only worked because her sensitivity never actually went away. It got refined instead of removed. A sensitive person who armors up and shuts down doesn't become powerful. She becomes numb, and numbness is its own kind of vulnerability, because it disconnects a person from the exact instincts that used to protect her once she finally learned to trust them. Real power, the kind we've been describing this entire time, doesn't come from feeling less. It comes from finally trusting what you feel enough to act on it, instead of constantly overriding it in the name of being agreeable, being easy, being someone nobody could ever accuse of being too much. The child scanning a room for danger and the adult who can read a negotiation, a relationship, or a room full of strangers with startling accuracy are running the exact same software. The only difference is decades of data and the hard-won willingness to finally believe what that data is telling her. So if you recognize yourself somewhere in this story, if you've spent years being told you feel too much, notice too much, take things too personally, I want you to consider a different possibility than the one you've probably been handed your entire life. What feels like a burden right now might simply be unfinished. Not wrong. Not too much. Unfinished. Every difficult pattern you've survived, every person who tested your boundaries and taught you the hard way where they needed to exist, every betrayal that forced you to look more closely at people than you ever wanted to, all of it has been quietly building something. Not scar tissue, instrumentation. And one day, likely without any single dramatic moment marking the exact turn, you'll notice you're no longer the person things happen to. You're the person who sees things coming, who reads a room before it reads itself, who can sit in the presence of someone trying to manipulate her and simply, calmly decline to participate. That isn't the end of your sensitivity. That's what your sensitivity was always becoming, the entire time you thought it was just something you had to survive.